Do doctors in training really make minimum wage? Maybe. You may have heard this before online or in a YouTube video, and I think sometimes it can be confusing or even misleading and sometimes incorrect. So let's clarify. Why do people say this? When people say doctors in training, we mean people in residency or fellowship. That means you finished medical school, but you're not yet an independent doctor practicing in a specialty like pediatrics or cardiology. For the most part, you can actually look up how much doctors in training make each year. It's public information. A third-year resident at Cornell makes $56,000 a year. A first-year resident at Nebraska makes $59,000 a year. Outside of cost of living, I'm not sure what goes into this, but it's not always what you would expect in terms of which universities or which academic hospitals pay residents more. You can go online yourself and look up a lot of different hospitals, but in general, residents and fellows make between $45,000 and $65,000 a year, which is a decent salary, and certainly not a salary that you might associate with someone working a minimum wage job. The average McDonald's worker makes $21,000 a year, for example. So where does this comparison even come from? Before we get into the weeds of it, I want to thank our sponsor for today's video, Masterworksio. Stay tuned for more on this company that lets you invest in shares of multi-million-dollar art pieces. So back to salaries for physicians in training. Why do people say that doctors in training make minimum wage or even less? We established that most of them make $50,000 a year and minimum wage jobs make less than half of that. It's because of the number of hours that doctors in training work each week. Doctors in training used to work an almost ungodly number of hours because there were essentially no restrictions. 90 or 100 or even 120 hours a week was a reality for many people. In the late 80s, a young woman died an essentially preventable death that was related to a resident and an intern being exhausted and not taking proper care of her, and that got a lot of people's attention. This actually led to legislation and new rules that limited the number of hours for doctors in training. And that 80 hours is the number that many use to calculate the hourly rate for doctors in training. So if you work 80 hours a week and you get about 3 weeks off for vacation per year, you end up working 80 hours a week for 49 weeks. That comes out to 3,920 hours per year. So if you're working as an intern or first-year resident making $56,000 a year in the Midwest, that works out to be about $14 an hour. I know there's been a lot of debate about minimum wage across the country, but currently, $14 an hour is less than the minimum wage in California, Washington State, and Washington, D.C., and it's about the same as the minimum wage in Connecticut. And remember, that's just one possible salary. There are residents that make less than $56,000 a year, so therefore their hourly wage is even less than $14 an hour. This is pretty dramatic, and it's worth mentioning, but it has one important caveat that you might be catching on to. This math is based on the assumption that doctors in training work 80 hours per week every week. I certainly can't speak for every doctor training program across the country, but in my circumstance, that was never the case. I was never working 80 hours per week every single week. It's true there are some rotations like the ICU that are busier and you might be working 80 hours every week, and sometimes more, which is probably making you stop and say, hey, I thought it was limited that you can't work more than 80 hours per week. But that's another place that this gets tricky. The 80-hour work week limit actually only applies when averaged out over 4 weeks. So you can work 90 hours one week as long as you work 70 hours the week after that. So it's only considered a violation of the rule if over the course of 4 weeks in a row, you work more than 320 hours. So training programs balance this out. So you might have a busy rotation for a couple of weeks where you're working more than 80 hours per week, but then you do a lighter rotation where you're working significantly less than 80 hours per week. So you don't go over that 80-hour week limit. I've only averaged 80 hours per week over a 4-week stretch, maybe 2 to 3 times during my internal medicine residency, and I've never done it as a GI fellow. I've always been well under 80 hours per week. When I'm on call, I might work 70 to 75 hours in a given week, but then I work dramatically less the week after that because I'm not on call anymore. This certainly isn't to say that certain specialties or other programs might be busier and have higher volumes of hours per week, but I think it's misleading to use 80 hours as just the standard baseline when making these calculations. That being said, even if you acknowledge the variability in the number of hours per week that doctors work and you maybe drop that a little bit in your calculations, the hourly rate for doctors in training is still surprisingly low, in my opinion, especially considering how important they are for many hospitals to function. On weekends, for example, you might have a single doctor in training covering dozens of patients in the hospital and being the only one that's physically in the hospital. And this has only been worsened by the pandemic. Of course, doctors in training are very privileged to work in medicine and have essentially a guaranteed massive pay bump 3 to 6 years down the road. But that doesn't mean they can always live comfortably, especially in their training years. So we talked a lot about what doctors make in a year, but what do doctors do with that money? There's a lot of ways to spend or invest your money, but one idea is something I never considered until I heard about today's sponsor, and that's Masterworksio. Masterworksio is a company that lets you invest in multi-million-dollar paintings at a fraction of the cost. Now, investing in art is something that I associate with the ultra-wealthy, mainly because art is so expensive. But Masterworks purchases these works of art for you. Artists like Warhol, Banksy, Picasso. Then you can purchase shares of it and you can enjoy the associated increase in value of the painting. or the profit once the painting is sold. So even if you don't know much about art, like me, you can invest in it easily without investing a lot of time. Their platform allows you to buy and sell shares of different paintings, just like buying stocks on your favorite trading app. So now you can include high-end artwork in your investment portfolio without having to buy a $10 million painting on your own. Obviously, people like you and me are more used to dealing with standard stocks with investing, but I was honestly shocked to learn contemporary art prices outpaced the S&P 500 total return by 174% from 1995 to 2020, according to Citibank. And Masterworks help you access this amazing asset class. They've been around since 2017, and their team has over 75 years of art buying experience with plans to purchase $400 million in art pieces next year. Over 260,000 investors have already signed up, and Masterworks is already worth over $1 billion, billion with a B. The uniqueness of this opportunity has resulted in a long wait list of people looking to join. But since I partnered with them on this video, you can skip the wait list and simply join now by clicking the link in the description. So go check it out. So let's go back to physician salaries. What's the takeaway from all of this? The takeaway is that doctors do make a good amount of money while they're in training, but not as much as you might expect or as much as they think they deserve. Of course, it's hard to legitimately complain when you're making $50,000 a year, but I think sometimes it comes down to appreciation. It's hard to feel appreciated when you take into account what the hourly rate is for a lot of these doctors. It's true, it's not quite minimum wage in most cases, but I think making that comparison gets people's attention. And that's really the goal of all of this. It's a little clickbaity, but it starts a conversation. And this is a conversation that's been amplified over the past 2 years by the pandemic, precisely because residents or doctors in training face the brunt of the waves from the COVID pandemic. They're often the doctors that are seeing a lot of these patients, especially in academic hospitals. And they aren't necessarily compensated for that. Their hours often go up, especially during these surges, but they're not necessarily paid more because of that. Residents don't get overtime pay. Doctors go through a lot in their training, and sometimes money can be an added stressor to that, even though they might make more than the average American. It's just something to think about. Thanks for watching. Thanks to Masterworks.io for sponsoring this video. Click the link below to sign up, and please comment below with any questions or any thoughts you have about this video. Thanks for watching.